Welcome to Bellevue Chamber webcast for Thursday, May 14th, 2020. Today we're joined by Workplace Strategist for HermanMiller, Kristin Reed, Senior Vice President for Kidder Mathews, Gary Guenther, and your host, Bellevue Chamber CEO, Joe Fain, as we explore back to work, PPE, social distancing, and the new office.
Thank you for joining us for our 14th webcast and the second in our Back to Work series to help our members and their teams succeed through the great transition. I'm Joe Fain, CEO of the Bellevue Chamber. Today we'll hear from two office-based experts to not only help you prepare for a safe return over the next weeks and months, but to also get us thinking about some of the permanent changes that may emerge in the wake of COVID-19. I'd like to start by thanking our webcast sponsor, Puget Sound Energy, for their support. Local Government Affairs and Public Policy Manager David Hoffman is here to share some of the ways PSC has kept the lights on and supported our community during these past few months. David?
Really want to thank Joe for the opportunity to sponsor the webinar today. The topic is one that we all care about, getting back to work. And I personally look forward to hearing from the speakers today. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
David, thanks very much. Of course, we're very grateful not only for the support of this and all the stuff that you're doing in the community, but as we know every day that there are folks responding out in the community to make sure that the power stays on. And in many cases, they're putting themselves in harm's way as an essential worker from the very beginning. And we know that just on Tuesday, they were out putting some power back together for one of our speakers in the webcast, and they got that promptly back on. And so we appreciate it. So. David, thanks so much for being here and for joining us.
Thank you.
If you're interested in joining Puget Sound Energy as a webcast sponsor, please go ahead and contact a member of the Chamber team. Now, before we turn to our presenters, I want to invite all of you to use the Q&A or the chat feature on your screen so that you can ask questions throughout the program today, and certainly to engage with your fellow webcast participants throughout the program using the chat feature. Most of us began working remotely after Governor Inslee's order nearly 10 weeks ago. Once crowded city streets became barren and our bustling high-rises sat largely empty. Now employers are preparing for a slow return to the workforce, and some like Amazon, the Port of Seattle, Microsoft, and others have announced that remote work will continue into the late summer or fall. And even yesterday, Twitter's CEO Jack Dorsey went as far to say that employees can work from home, quote, forever. But today we're going to hear a little bit from some of the experts about what the return might look like and to help us prepare and adjust to the rise of remote work. I would certainly like to welcome a great board member here with the Bellevue Chamber, Senior Vice President and shareholder with Kidder Mathews. Please welcome Gary Guenther. Gary, welcome.
Thank you, Joe.
So I hear you got a good presentation for us today, running through some of your prognostications and best practices or how to put some folks back to work. So I'm just going to give you the floor and let you go through that. And once again, remind folks to use the chat and Q&A feature throughout this as something sparks your interest. And we want to come back with a follow-up question. So Gary, the floor is yours.
Excellent. I am just looking for my slides. Is it not them? Might need a little help here finding my slides. Aha. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I can't tell you how excited I am to be part of a webinar that's actually talking about getting back to the office because, like many of you, I'm kind of getting tired of working from home. My comments today are going to be based off of a lot of conversations that I've had over the past couple months with people in the industry, attorneys, contractors, architects, tenants, and landlords. Also at Kidder Mathews, we have 22 offices up and down the West Coast, including Nevada and Arizona. We've been having weekly calls comparing what's happening in respective markets. And a large part of this presentation comes to you from our property management division. They manage 70 million square feet in 5 states and have put together a really great back to work package that will be a handout when this is done. They developed that by taking into consideration health organizations, CDC, WHO guidelines, as well as, of course, government regulations. So I'm going to talk in 4 parts today. Number 1, tenant considerations when coming back to the office, landlord responsibilities or considerations, what development may look like, because believe it or not, office development is happening right now. And then finally, where do we go from here in Bellevue? So to start off, here are some important considerations that companies or tenants should keep in mind as we head back to the office. Number one, prepare your people. This is almost as much of a psychological virus as it is a physical one. I'm not trying to downplay the severity, but there's a lot of anxiety out there. I am aware of a company in our market who was providing some essential services, and they had their protocols in place, but they were kind of clumsy about how they communicated that to their people, trying to bring people back to the office. One of the employees freaked out, wound up calling OSHA, Department of Health, a number of other organizations, and really set back their timeline. So I think the lesson there is to do it correctly the first time and clearly communicate with your employees how you're going to bring them back. We need to make sure that tenants are controlling access when they're coming back to their space, making sure you know who's coming into the space, why, and how, making sure that PPE, assuming you can get it, is available to all your employees, limit who's coming in and out of the space. In some cases, we're seeing employers getting ready to provide thermometers. Also, there's thermal scan technology that's out there, but really subject to the size of your company and your budget. I have a healthcare organization that I work with, and this is one end of the spectrum. They had lines going into their facility set up with temperatures being taken and questions being asked. That really helped mitigate transmission of this. That's really one end of the spectrum, but it obviously works if you're taking control of the process. Create social distancing. Social distancing seems to be the phrase of 2020 so far. The phrase within the office market is going to be de-densification. That means more square footage per employee. We've been on this trend over the past few years of less square footage per employees, going from 250 square feet 15 years ago down to 150 square feet or less. We're going to see that reversed, and that's going to be reversed via furniture reconfiguration, staggering of people coming into the office, or a combination of both. There'll be a lot of directional signage within spaces, similar to what you see when you go to the grocery store. And at least my observations, I see half the people following it and half the people not paying attention. I have a feeling that's going to be what it looks like when people get back to the office. Lots of plexiglass is going to go up. Not that that's the end all be all, but you'll see a lot of that. And then there are some companies that have some physical constraints with permanent improvements. So they may have to spend some money, which could, inevitably delay their return to the office. Obviously, reduce touch points and increase cleanings. Tenants are going to be looking for no-touch faucets, no-touch flush valves, self-opening doors, bathrooms that you pull open and push to get out without touching the handle. Those will become more common. Of course, sanitation stations and multiple cleanings per day. And then finally, communication. I can't emphasize this enough. Communicate. Make sure your employees feel safe, you're listening to them, because the last thing we need is for this to get litigious and back us up even further. Now, landlords of office buildings are also doing their part. These are some of the responsibilities that they have. I'll just touch on a few of these. Building systems, obviously a real important consideration is HVAC. So we're going to see landlords that are making sure more fresh air is being brought into the buildings. The HVAC systems are running longer to make sure the air is getting flushed through the buildings. There'll be more filters put in place, HEPA filters, UV disinfecting lighting systems, and supplemental air purification systems in some cases. Elevators, of course, will be disinfected regularly, and there will be capacity limits put in place. Building operations, building ingress, egress will be limited, most likely, and again, enhanced cleaning. And it's very important, going back to the communication, that landlords are clearly communicating what they're doing to keep their building safe and their tenants safe via their safety measures. And then I think a very interesting one's going to be building amenities. Food service, we're already kind of experimenting with that out in the world, but things like fitness centers, common areas, those may be mothballed for some time. And at the very least, we'll have pretty strict social distancing for those. Our property management group put together a reopening checklist, and this is for landlords, but I think it's good for companies and tenants to take a look at as well. It details what responsibilities are, what items need to take place to make buildings safe again, who's responsible for them, and what the cost is. And again, all this will be available to you if you want it. Here are some signs you're probably going to see when you get back into the office building. Obviously, you mentioned elevator usage, and then a lot of reminders, face covering, washing hands often, using sanitation stations, social distancing, and I don't think we're going to see a lot of people wanting to bend over a water fountain anytime in the near future. Now, as I mentioned before, there is still development going on, contrary to popular opinion. In fact, just across the street from my office building, there's a 1 million square foot project that they're digging into dirt right now. I don't think they're doing it for fun. They're doing it to build it and to tenant it. But these are some considerations that landlords are looking into. And landlords, contractors, and architects are all right now putting their heads together and trying to figure out what they need to do, if they do need to do significant redesigns or not. But so a couple areas that I think are important to keep in mind. Common area, the very popular trend over the past 15 years for new buildings has been great rooms where tenants can have impromptu meetings, collaborate. Those, it will be interesting to see if those are rethought or not. Of course, we mentioned HVAC systems. There'll be no touch interfaces everywhere. Environmental friendly materials have been the trend the past few years, and this, if anything, is going to accelerate that. But I do think we need to be careful about overcorrection. A lot of these buildings, or developments, I should say, are 2 to 3 years out, even if they're starting right now. So hopefully we are beyond this, or at the very least beyond the very worst of it. I always have to, when I give a presentation, give a forecast of where we're going next. And right now, we're really in a holding pattern as far as the market's concerned. We're advising our clients to really just hold tight unless you have a compelling need to contract or expand. Don't do anything or try to do something short term. Provide yourself as much flexibility as possible. We may see larger deals who want to do longer terms because they need tenant improvement money to get those transactions done to build out their space. We may see a trend where there's an annual rent reset. Landlords are going to fight it, but that's something to look for. I think other tenants are going to follow the leaders just like they've done up till this point. And we have a great roster of amazing world-class tenants in this area. And the sort of catchphrase over the past few years is office space as a recruiting and retention tool. And I think the catchphrase moving forward may very well be flexible office space and employer empathy in order to retain and attract key employees. We will continue to see work from home, absolutely. Some tenants, or I should say companies, are thriving this way. I understand that Microsoft is having a lot of success with some of their coders writing more and better code than ever. There's other people like me who are kind of dying a slow death with not being productive at home. A lot of people I talk to are in the same boat. So we're excited to get back to work, but I do think their employers are going to have a lot of flexibility and allow their employees to work from home, in many cases at their option. Co-working facilities are going to be challenged. On one hand, they're going to be good for the larger companies that have flexible space options. On the other hand, many of them have to rework their common areas. Having beer from the free beer tap and playing ping pong with a stranger in the common area just probably isn't as appealing these days. And again, going back to overcorrection, there's some concerns that we make too many drastic changes. So we need to take this slow and kind of almost go day by day like we have been. I do think finally that Bellevue is better positioned than most companies in the market, most cities in the country. We have world-class companies that are taken large chunks of space. There's a lot of development going on. We have very smart developers and landlords. And so I think we're going to get through this. When we come out, I think we're going to be better off than when we started. It just will be different. The last thing I want to end on here is that, when this whole thing started, a lot of us were trying to make sense of it. And we were trying to compare it to things that happened in the past, like 9/11, great financial crisis. And the reality is that it's nothing like those. It's much worse from a financial standpoint. However, I do think that there are some parallels that can be drawn, at least from a psychological standpoint, to 9/11. That happened a couple of years after I got into the business. And there was a real fear of going back into your office building that you could die. And I remember, and very similar to today, and I remember there were forecasts that skyscrapers, tall buildings would never be filled, and particularly the higher bank offices would be vacant or at drastically reduced rents. And of course, that didn't happen because landlords were able to address tenants' concerns, get innovative, come up with more security. And so I'm very hopeful and optimistic that that's going to happen this time around. Things are definitely going to look different, but I think with innovation, with the world-class companies we have in this area, working with our great landlords, I think we will come out ahead of this and we'll be better off. It'll just look different. So with that, thank you. And I have one more slide here just for the handouts at the end. So those will be made available to anybody who wants them.
Gary, thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions that are coming through both over text, chat, and Q&A. Of course, the first thing that folks really want to make sure that you're aware of is they love your beard. I think it's fantastic. So keep up the good work there.
Thank you.
Another one of the issues that comes up is who's responsible? And that's kind of in a two-part question. Who's responsible in your mind for the providing that PPE and the things that individuals are going to have to use when they return to work? And then what kind of liability can we expect employers to face, as a result of people that might be exposed? Are we thinking that the government's going to take a very clear standards-based approach, and if you follow those standards, you're okay? Or is there going to be, is there going to be a litigation fear that keeps people home just as much as a viral fear?
I think on the first question, whose responsibility is it? I think it's a shared responsibility between landlords and tenants. Landlords need to take care of the companies within their buildings, within their common areas, making sure that they're cleaning, providing safety, the PPE, and then it's the tenant's responsibility, within their space to be able to make their employees feel safe and provide them the materials, the PPE that they need. Your second question, that's a tough one. I do hope that the government will step in, and because if we do have a lot of litigation, it could be a disaster. I mean, it could really, because you can obviously see it coming. So it's a little out of my area of expertise, but I do think that absolutely needs to be addressed moving forward.
One thing that is in your area of expertise and that you referenced a little earlier on is the overall development pipeline. You very frequently speak to the chamber and other groups about the buildings that we see coming to town on the east side and in Bellevue. Any specifics about projects that are being delayed, or talks about financing falling through, or tenants that might be on sort of a design build contract with somebody saying, we need to put a hold on this at this point? Or is it still too early to tell?
It's bottom line, it's still too early to tell. I've talked to some contractors, I've talked to some developers, and everybody's still trying to figure it out. They're putting their heads together. They're trying to determine costs, because costs, I think, are inevitably going to go up. So it's still, it remains to be seen. But, as I mentioned, I happen to be in my office today because I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. I know you can relate to that, and I didn't want them to barge in, but maybe people can hear in the background, they're going great guns across the street for Vulcan's project in downtown Bellevue, 1 million square feet. And again, like I referenced earlier, I don't think they're doing it just for fun. So I do think we'll continue to see development, but it's, I think, too early to say what's not going to move forward and exactly how it's going to move forward when it does.
There are folks that are kind of prognosticating on a whole sorts of what the future looks like, and one of the things that keeps coming up is the idea that we might actually see a rebirth of the suburbs a little bit, or that the behaviors that individuals engage in could change. So even if they are headed back to that central workplace, to that downtown high rise, when work is over, they're less likely to stay in the community, less likely to go to the restaurant, and more likely to just hightail at home. Are there any larger economic-wide behavioral changes that are possibly on the horizon that folks are either thinking about or that haven't even considered yet?
It's a great question. I think from the standpoint of one of the reasons why I think Bellevue is going to have a better rebound than maybe some other more urban, even though we do have an urban core downtown, I think that the fact that we're not overly reliant on transit, which was a bad thing up until a couple months ago, maybe a bad thing in the future. But it's obviously we have light rail coming through in the future. But for now, most people tend to drive their cars to work. So I think that is a good thing for our area. And I think it is going to give a boost to the suburban properties. As far as other general economic concerns or surprises, I guess I'd have to think on that a little bit. And it seems to be something new popping up every day, but nothing that alarms me other than every other thing that's alarming out there in the world right now.
Well, I certainly do relate to the 4-year-old and the 2-year-old. Lincoln turns 2 in June. Moxon turned 2 weeks ago, and so
we're on track.
Yeah, I'm locked down in my basement right now, hiding from them. So, Gary, thanks so much for joining us. I know we're going to have more questions for you on the back end, but I want to bring in our next speaker right now, which is Kristin Reed, a workplace strategy consultant with HermanMiller. Kristin has 20 years of experience advising organizations to best engage employees, transform workplaces, and navigate change. As a workplace strategy consultant in the areas of culture, change, and workplace design, Kristin's experience spans all industries, ranging from small businesses to Fortune 500 organizations. And though she lives in Southern California, she has spent much of her time sharing her experience and her expertise with companies up here in this region. And also, I would like to thank another longtime Bellevue board member and former chair, David Mason with Catalyst Activation, for introducing us to Kristin. Kristin, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So you've got a skill set that couldn't be in higher demand right now. Tell us how you're approaching this, and I understand that you've also got a presentation to share with us. So, give us your thoughts, and I'm just going to hand the floor over to you. Thanks, Kristin.
Sure. And I may need some help pulling up those slides, so I'd appreciate that. Thank you. It's interesting, and it's good to hear Gary lead with in his thoughts of thinking about people in addition to place. And as I share with you today, what we're talking with clients about, what we're thinking, our point of view today, that also seems to be changing very rapidly or with new information. But we really are looking at the whole experience of work, not just physical place, but also people and the way work gets done. So I'm going to share just kind of high level some of the things that we are looking towards, some of the things that we believe as of today immediately, thinking about what's next, whatever that next timeline might be, but then also thinking ahead and kind of that crystal ball thinking. So as I go through and first starting with immediate needs, and many of the things that we're talking about with clients are some of the same things you heard Gary talk about. How do we bring people back into the office, bring them back together? We all want some sense of normalcy, even though we know that normal will look very different as we come forward. We're having a lot of conversations around how do we manage distance, or how do we figure out who and when to bring people back in the office? How do we maintain spaces, cleanliness, not just the individual works points, but also all of those places that we shared, whether they're within your office or perhaps in lobbies or other shared areas. But on the same time, we're still balancing supporting remote work and that quick kind of thrown into remote work, and how do we keep people connected and engaged and productive as they're doing that. And then as part of that too, supporting both kinds of work, we're all going through a lot of change, and leaders have done very well in communication, connecting and helping us best that we can. But we are all getting a little weary of just this very change difference. So that's something that we're talking about right now. How do we continue to combat, leading change, but also combating that fatigue? A big question that I believe is important to think about, whether you're talking about right now or down the road, is why return to the office. And that's not to say the office is going to go away, or it will be something else. But really taking that measured approach, as Gary mentioned, maybe continued a work from home kind of a cadence until we figure out really what does return to the office mean. So we're always asking that question: who and why are we doing this? A couple of things that I want to share with you, and some research some data that we uncovered, and we're doing a survey with about 330 employees in the West, thanks to our partnership with Catalyst in Seattle and others in Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. But on the left side of the screen, I first just want to highlight, as we think about the people, and what does that mean when we're talking about coming back to the office? We're questioning everything now. I'm questioning whether I can touch a doorknob, or questioning the things that we never thought before. And that kind of undermines our underlying sense of trust. And not that we all of a sudden do not trust each other, but we're just questioning things. And that's undermining some of those fundamental needs, or those fundamental things. What we've learned from the survey, and I'll use a combination of the data points on the right with some of the findings on the left. First of all, on the left, we want a different work schedule and some kind of mix of remote work. We're hearing that from others. We're reading that. A lot of us are seeing that in the in the various kinds of research. In the survey that we did across those Western states that I mentioned, we found that a very small percentage of people want to come back into the workplace in a regular 5-day work week. Now, they're looking for some kind of flexibility, and they're finding that they're able to kind of adapt to a new way of working, or realize that there may be this new normal, maybe different ways of working. So we found just a very small percent want to come back 5 days a week. The second bullet point on the left, we know that we want to see each other. In the survey that we did and others research that you see, a majority, 81% as we found, say they want to be with their colleagues, they want to see each other, we want to have those impromptu collaborations, but yet we're still worried about how and where that's going to happen. More than half in the smaller study that we did. So we're really concerned about being together in those spaces. And when we are together, but if we have to wear masks and talk like this, or be 6 feet apart from each other, will we really feel that connection and belonging that we're craving? The fourth bullet down, when we think about people want to know what's going on, even if there's no updates or even the not so great news. Solid communication strategy is key. In fact, with the survey that we did, the 330 people, 3/4 specifically said that the communications and the regular check-ins from their leaders or their frontline managers was key to helping them adjust and adapt. And then finally, we asked just a general question: what do you think the future of work will be? And more than half, just on their own, said that they believe a mix of remote work and in-office will be key to the future. And a mix is an important word as you think about what does that look like. The next few things that I want to show you are some of the specifics that we're talking about in this immediate, when we do begin to bring people back, what might that look like in an office, in an existing space. Our design, my design colleagues within HermanMiller and others, such as our dealer partners and so on, have been looking at hundreds of floor plans with our clients and helping them assess what does it look like on day one when I'm bringing people back. What can we do to accommodate when people have to be in the office and farther away. What we're finding, if you look on the left, generally, we're seeing about a 50% reduction in the overall seat count across a floor plate. So right off the bat, you can plan on about half of your seats being gone with that 6 foot distance. What we're finding is that when you look at group spaces, places that we're doing together work with the open collaboration types of spaces, so things without walls, we're seeing an even greater reduction in seat count, perhaps up to 71% reduction. And in enclosed meeting room spaces, conference rooms, other hard-walled type areas, about 40%, so just under half in that overall count. And as we're looking at 6 feet of distance, of course, we're looking at seats and from center of chair to center of chair and thinking about that diameter around and how can we protect ourselves but we're also having to think about circulation paths and, what if we're moving around a lot because we won't sit stationary for the entire time. So right off the bat, we know that we're losing some. So again, to the question of at what percent of people should we bring them in? And thinking about the real importance of being in place versus remote. Another thing that we're thinking about are meetings rooms. So we know, based on what I just talked about, that about 40% of our enclosed meeting room seats will be gone because of the 6 feet of distance. But we're also looking at repurposing meeting rooms into individual work points. If you look at the lower right side of the slide that I'm showing, perhaps we're converting a meeting room into individual work points. If you're looking for an opportunity to space people out between on a floor and in a room, or perhaps providing a little more capacity for those times when people have to come into the space. On the upper right corner, another thing that we are talking about are using reservation systems. Not just to schedule rooms and keep a tight look on how rooms are being used, but adding in those times before and after meetings where you may want to clean or have the room reset and prepared for the next use. Looking to our offices in Asia, in Hong Kong specifically, to see what they're doing is helping us understand perhaps what we should be preparing for. If you look on the left side, my colleague Tatiana in our Hong Kong office, it's a multi-tenant building. When she and others enter into the lobby, they're going through an infrared temperature screening that is done by a third party. And then when they get up to our space on the 47th floor, an additional temperature check is happening. Masks are required. And also, the space isn't just open to anyone to access any day. You do have to pre-schedule time in office, so through a calendar or other means, and schedule yourself in. On the right side, looking at our floor plan, we're using a very specific process to help control occupancy and make sure people are feeling safe, as well as keeping them as safe as possible. Yellow spaces that you see on the floor plan are individual work points. So when you sign up for that day, you're in an assigned space. Meeting rooms, there too are based on reservation use only. So no drop-in or unreserved kind of use for those spaces. There's a lot of talk about boundaries and panels and how do we create separation, and a lot of our employees or people are saying, maybe we do need panels. Are we talking about, very high cubicle walls again? What does this mean? A couple of things around that. First, as we look at panels and their ability to keep us safe in a workplace, the jury's still out on that. The science has not definitively told us that panels will, in fact, keep us healthy and keep some other measure of distance from us. As we're talking about panels and using them, whether they're shorter just to control circulation, something to help someone at a seated height or even a standing height, this may be a question of is the investment or the correction that we want to make now one that we know will help with perception and employees' feeling of safety or when they're having to come in, or is it something that perhaps the science will tell us soon on the reality of different kinds of boundaries, whether they be fabric, whether they be plexiglass or other things that we've been hearing about. We're also talking a lot about antimicrobials and how do we clean fabrics. Here too, the science still has not informed us to a 100% degree that we know this will happen. But after a careful review, our material scientists have determined that we use microbe care as an antimicrobial option on select products. I'm sure, as we learn more, as our material scientists keep working and identifying what may be our point of view, will update on this. But as of right now, we have identified this one. The last couple of things that I want to talk about here is thinking about after those immediate needs. So we are bringing people back in the office, and we're thinking about who and when and how do we do it for safety. We're also having to think about what's next. First asking why bring people into the office. And I think it's very interesting as we're seeing more and more organizations like Amazon, like Microsoft, and Twitter and others saying, we really are going to push the pause button on bringing people back and take a measured approach on what's next and thinking ahead. Some of the things that we're thinking about as we're starting to have those conversations of what's next, again, why the office versus other third space, and what does that mix look like, because they're both very important for different types of work activities, and what might a longer term strategy around mobility and flexibility and how people choose where they work, how can that enhance our engagement, but also enhance the best use of real estate in the portfolio. The third bullet down, as we're learning more, the science are going to help us. It's going to evolve and we're going to learn more. But there are some data points that we can look to even starting now, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. I mentioned the choices or the corrections that you may choose to make, and what are those that will help perceptions, help us as people feel safe, yet they won't make us feel a little too safe. Or feed into that change fatigue, and then versus those that we know that will really help. When I mentioned data, there are lots of different data streams to look at, not just people and feedback data, but also on how space and things are actually used. At HermanMiller, our live platform system, and there are many other systems, but before COVID, we were looking at data to figure out, well, how can we create more of a buzz about the space? How can we get more people into the space, perhaps, or more people thinking about using the space? And maybe that has turned around a little bit, at least in the short term. Now, how can we look at data to help us inform when a space may be used too much, how a space may have to be maintained in order for it to be used, or perhaps how a workspace or even third spaces have to help people be able to balance the different kinds of individual and group work that they need. Lots of different examples. I love this example, looking across a week, left to right, hour by hour, and having the data points that give you that perspective of the dark color at the bottom, perhaps individual desks or individual work points, the green color in the middle, perhaps group or shared spaces, the peaks and valleys, when there may be more demand for space or less, when cleaning or other types of services should be done, perhaps on a Tuesday, maybe more intense kind of cleaning than a Thursday or a Friday or even a Monday morning. But then also looking at the gray area at the top, always kind of having a handle on where is that excess. And perhaps in that excess, you could even think about redesigning in different settings to help spread out or create a different experience. The last thing that I want to share with you in terms of thinking ahead, and this is that crystal ball that we all wish we knew what was going to happen. When we wish we knew if it were going to be 2020, 2021, or is it something else? There's so many variables that are, that influence this. But a few things that we are thinking about today and looking to data science and other things to inform us. We certainly know that the office will be viewed as a very purposeful, strategic choice. And I mean, not just by those of us tasked with corporate real estate responsibilities or facilities responsibilities, but perhaps also with the users, the employees and their own experience. And I believe there are going to be some shifting conversations around how to use place as a purposeful choice that will help us do our best work and help our organizations make the most of their space. I believe, and we all believe, there are going to be some long-term strategies around flexible and agile mobile work, if you will, and that mix and a different experience. The fourth bullet down around technology and automation, we know that technology is going to change. Someone mentioned to me the other day that we're probably in the infancy stage, even though we think some things are quite advanced. As we look to other types of technology and automation, is touchless the way to go? Is it something else? Is it a different experience with the technology we use day in and day out for our work? And how does that play into the physical place or even into our homes, and how might that happen? And of course, there are a lot of other unknowns that we wish we knew, and we just wish that we could have a pulse on, but we will wait and see. So with that, I will turn it over to see if there are any questions. Thank you.
That's excellent, and I'm blown away about all of the different and quite costly modifications that we could see happening in our physical workspaces in the future. And so, Kristin, it kind of begs one of the questions around the issues of equity in large companies with larger margins that might be able to move in and make these kind of changes, and versus the small companies that may not have the available resources. Has this become the new buffet dining hall? We always think about the accoutrements that some of the tech sector have used to attract young talent out of into their programming developer positions, and a lot of those things that have been used have been about socializing and about connectedness and interactivity. Is this going to change is this going to be something that companies use to attract workers in the future, the level of investment in these kind of safety precautions?
I think there will be some influence. I don't know to what degree that will be. I think we as employees, our expectations will evolve. We'll be looking to organizations to do certain things or have a very strong position on certain things, making sure that we can do our best work and be healthy, and also supporting sustainability in the community and all of those other things. So yes, to your answer, but I think it remains to be seen.
A question that came across here that I can relate to. I've had one job in my life where I was at a open cubicle hot desk situation. Is the hot desk, the hot swappable desk, is that officially dead now?
I don't believe it's dead, but like the first answer, I believe it will be used differently. I think in the short term, and by short term I say it could be months or into the end of the year. It will be a cautious use of it. There are lots of things we have to think about with those shared surfaces. But on the other hand, I believe that as we're looking at more flexible and mobile ways of working, the hot desk will take on new meaning with that jump space, but unassigned space will take on new meaning. And as we look at the unassigned experience, even within a workplace or the third place, and more conversation around everything that has to be done to support that unassigned experience.
This kind of a change of physical space, first of all, physical space is something that is important for companies and higher ups in companies to think about, has really become popular in the last 15, 20 years about creating those, natural moments where people interact with one another and ideas can be shared, and their creation of energy in a workplace. What we're seeing in some of the slides that you have there is quite obviously, a return to a far more separated, less likely to come in contact with one another, and that dramatically changes the kind of ethos or the energy of an office. From a morale perspective, from a psychological perspective, what kind of impacts do you think these kind of changes are going to have in companies, especially with a modern workforce and a younger workforce that might be quite used to the opposite?
Mm-hmm. I think it will. If we look back to those fundamental things that we expect in work, connection and belonging are one of those things. And there are lots of different terms for that, but we want to be together. And what we're finding, what others are finding, is after this experience of being in our homes or with less control over when we can see each other, we're wanting that even more. I think that in the workplace, we're going to have to think differently and how we're designing to bring us together. I think it's going to be a mix of physical use of different technologies and use of different ways of connecting to each other, both in a scheduled way and also just an impromptu way. And on that same note, both for work but also socially, that will look different. I think it's going to be more of a mix. Again, I believe it remains to be seen how, but we'll definitely see a difference.
how quickly are we going to expect companies to move in this direction? These kind of tenant improvements are not at all cheap. And as Gary was talking about, and we'll ask him some more in a moment, that there's going to be some expectation of shared responsibility from landlord and tenant on making some of these improvements. And lease prices are completely in flux right now as we have a hard time to understand demand. How quickly can we should company owners and land managers be out there and facility managers be out there saying we have to make these changes?
That might be a good question for Gary to answer. If you bring him back in, he could answer certainly from the landlord and tenant.
Perfect. Well, Gary, you've been called on here. So how do you, when you're having conversations with your clients and other developers and company managers, when are they expecting to make these kind of investments?
I think in many cases they're still in the planning stage right now, but I think ultimately, some of these things will be, considered capital improvements. Some of these things will be considered operating expenses, which can be passed through to tenants. So I would say, it's going to be a shared cost. It kind of depends how a tenant's lease is written, whether or not a landlord can pass through amortized capital improvement costs. But I think at a minimum, if you're a tenant, your operating expenses are going to go up. You can count on that. But as far as, it's really in the works. It's happening right now. And I hate to keep kicking this out that everybody's still trying to figure it out, but everybody's still trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
No, it's not an uncommon theme from the webcasts that we've had over the last 2 months, where kind of the bottom line is these are everyone's best guess as we're putting it together. You brought up an interesting issue a few minutes ago, Gary, about traffic and cars and transit dependency, and there's certainly, as we've become a much more dense region, and where downtown Bellevue in particular has become a lot more dense with a lot more development on the horizon, there's really been a need to expand our use of transit in order to move those folks in and out. And there's been a lot of incentives put in place, transportation management programs to get people to carpool, to get people to van pool, to get people on, the new light rail line that's coming in. One, what kind of an expected shift can you kind of predict in the modes that people are getting to work? And then kind of a related question, what kind of physical infrastructure and capacity is going to be needed to accommodate that? And are your clients starting to think about those issues?
And this might be, kick this over to Kristin too. I think, a lot of it's going to rely on the deep densification that I talked about. People working in shifts. I just feel like, we have, downtown Bellevue in my building, we have a 2 per 1,000 parking ratio. That doesn't come close to providing cars for the amount of people in our building. So a lot of our staff in particular rely on transit. And I just think right now people still are not going to feel safe using transit to a great extent. So I think in the short term, it's going to be, de-densification of workstations in combination with staggering shifts until we kind of, work our way out of this.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, now all of this sudden the work experience, as we thought about, when you enter the door of the office to when you leave, now all of a sudden is almost from when we open our eyes in the morning until when we close our eyes in the morning. To your point exactly, employees are thinking, well, if I have to come into the office, but that means before that I'm, concerns will be raised if I'm concerned about risks or exposure on public transportation, for example, or other things. Perhaps I have to worry about childcare or care for others, where I may have relied on summer programs. Now as school is winding down, and what will that mean? And certainly, leaving work. Am I taking home anything that I didn't, have when I left home in the morning? And making sure of that. So I think all of those things, transportation and everything will, and that expanded view of what the work experience is, things that companies can't control, are critical as we go forward.
Got two more questions for both of you, so we'll get to them kind of quickly. The first one is an economics question. When you're making these kind of changes, when you're changing your square footage requirements, when you're putting these kind of programs in place, it has an impact on the local economy. And we look at the city streets right now that have been pretty quiet for the last couple of weeks, and it certainly has hurt a lot of the companies and businesses that rely on that foot traffic. What kind of changes in the local economy of a downtown in and around these businesses can we expect from the changes that are going to have to be made?
Well, I think here in Bellevue, it's unfortunate that a lot of these restaurants have been suffering. Obviously, retail isn't open, but I think we're going to inevitably probably see some closures. I just encourage people to get out and do takeout as much as you possibly can. But it's certainly with these technology companies that are not coming back until fourth quarter or even 2021 in some cases, it's going to have a pretty tough impact on retailers.
Yeah, and I agree. And I wonder, Gary, to the point you brought up early in your section about amenity spaces, cafeterias, and things where they were provided by companies. How might that, although it's not all of a sudden make sure someone can stay in business, but how might that then be reflected out to the local community and providers rather than having a cafeteria on site? How might that go out to the local restaurants or cafes or things?
I heard somewhere that companies may put more microwaves in space. Maybe you had mentioned that as well, but scatter the space with microwaves so people can just bring their food in and eat in their office with microwave food. So,
last quick question for the both of you, and very tactical one. You're a owner or operator of a small to mid-sized company. You've got office workers that you're trying to think about. When do I bring them back, and what do I need? What is the first couple things that I need to do once I do make the decision to bring them back? Give us your impression of that steps 1, 2, and 3 punch list that these folks should be considering and being prepared to act on. Starting with Kristin.
The first thing is to have a good read on who and why we're bringing people back. Should it be a smaller group, maybe essential, maybe not, or something else. I think the second thing is communication. So as you're figuring out how we're going to do this and who and what, very clear communication, almost over communicating that information. And obviously making sure that all of the protocols and the processes that are put in place are working. So very simplified top 3.
I really don't have anything. I think that's perfect. That's exactly what I would say too.
Well, I'm not going to make you say words if they've already been said well enough. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you both very much for joining. I really appreciate this. Was a great conversation for a lot of questions that a lot of folks have been asking. So, thank you to Kristin Reed and Gary Guenther for taking the time to share your expertise and your predictions. And I hope that you'll join us next Tuesday at 9:30 for another visit with state leaders, this time with the Senate Education Chair, Lisa Wellman, Representative Thomas Sen, and Representative Karen Eslick, as they take a closer look at human services, early childhood education, and the strain that the pandemic has put on our social safety net. Our Eastside Education Network founder, Beth Sigel, will be joining us to moderate that discussion. Then I hope that you will join us over the noon hour on Thursday, May 21st, where we'll be able to hear directly from Puget Sound Energy CEO Mary Kipp. And stay tuned for details and registration information for this year's virtual leadership conference on the future of work, kicking off on Friday, June 5th. With weekly interactive programs featuring world-renowned leaders and entrepreneurs running every Friday throughout the summer. That registration information will be out there very soon, and we're excited to be kicking it off on the 5th of June with one of the human resource leads for Amazon as we continue this conversation about the ever-adapting environment for workers. You can find all of these webcasts as well as our previous 12 programs on demand at bellevuechamber.org or at the conclusion of today's program. Again, thank you so much to Puget Sound Energy. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you on Tuesday. Thanks.
Thank you.